Hello, 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 hello. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Hello, hello, testing. Sit like this. Yes, you got it. Is this in the way? Oh, it is. Yeah. I guess we can stand here and give it to people. Then, basically. Yeah, I'm looking at the like, you know, I don't know, but I got to. Find out. Yeah. Yeah. Is that move slide? Yeah, so that's the middle button is a pointer.
hold this the whole time. I think I can manage that. Yeah. Or could I sit here? For example? That's too. This is. That's pretty, no, that's comfortable, actually. That. Okay, yeah, yeah, that's more comfortable, especially if I'm holding this the whole time, yeah. Okay, great. I suggested that, and it could not. Yeah.
Right?
And I get. Double. Yeah. Should I?
Yeah. This is already something, or do you? Okay. Right. I'm just looking at, for time. There. And the usual thing that. Like, Michael, let me introduce you to something. Hello, Michael. How are you? Nice to meet you. Thank you for coming. No, no, that's the reason I'm here. Welcome and apologize for the weather.
I'm not doing it myself.
No.
Thank you.
Not that bad, even Ireland is that bad. Here for very long. Oh, that's all.
Yes, you can.
Hi, testing.
They had a considerable effort to get away from the pen and book it. The way of proceeding. NTU or Doesn't that say like decades ago?
Testing. Can I do this? Hi. Hi.
Is this working? Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. The microphone is for the benefit of the people online, but you can all hear me fine, right? Great. So for those who don't know me, my name's Roger Nelson, and I'm with the Art History Department here in the School of Humanities at NTU. And it's my really actually great pleasure to introduce to you tonight's speaker for the NTU Distinguished Lectures in the Humanities series. And just a sort of a warning and an apology that my introduction might be slightly longer than usual, partly so that those people who are running late miss out on hearing me, not on hearing Saloni. But also, and importantly, because I want to try to convey some sense of how our speakers' work relates to larger developments in the discipline of art history, as well as in the humanities more broadly. So Saloni Mathur is Professor of Modern and Contemporary South Asian Art in the Department of Art History at UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles. And as you may know, the Art History Department at UCLA is particularly distinguished for its emphasis on diverse global art histories, as well as interdisciplinary approaches. Professor Mathur has been working at UCLA for 24 years. She has served as department chair, and she currently teaches courses on topics ranging from post-colonialism and imperialism to museum studies. With a training in anthropology and a sustained interest in post-colonial theory, Professor Mathur certainly embodies the interdisciplinarity for which UCLA art history is so well known. Like many art historians, alongside her work in the university, Professor Mathur also has strong links with museums and with curating. She is currently on a year-long fellowship at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, as the Ford Foundation Scholar in Residence. This highly prestigious appointment enables her unique access to an increasingly globalizing museum while she works on her next book project, which she'll be speaking about today. Previously, she has also co-curated a major solo exhibition of the senior late Indian artist, Vivan Sundaram, at the Fowler Museum at UCLA. Professor Mathur's most recent book, titled A Fragile Inheritance, Radical Stakes in Contemporary Indian Art, was published by Duke University Press in 2019. It is a beautifully poetic and reflexive engagement with the practice of one artist, Vivan Sundaram, and one critic named Geeta Kapoor. The monograph has been, I should also say that these two, the artist and the critic, have together shaped much of the discourse on South Asian art in the past half century. The monograph has been widely acclaimed, including by none other than Arjun Appadurai, who writes that the book, and I quote, turns the biographical norm inside out, reading their lives as illuminations of their tempestuous times and not simply as cases or examples of larger processes. It is in these kinds of ways that Professor Mathur, in particular, and art historical scholarship more broadly, is able to contribute to thinking that extends far beyond the discipline itself. Before this, Professor Mathur's previous books include 2 edited volumes that have been hugely influential in fields of diaspora studies and museum studies, and they remain widely read and cited today, including by many of our colleagues and students here in Southeast Asia. One of these, titled No Touching, No Spitting, No Praying, The Museum in South Asia, develops a complex critique of museums as tools both of colonial rule and of anti-colonial resistance. A second, titled The Migrant's Time, Rethinking Art History and Diaspora, is foundational to the recent turn to transnationally mobile artists active in the 20th and 21st centuries. That book is published by the Clark Art Institute and Yale University Press. Professor Mathur is also an exceptional essayist, alternating between focused monographic studies of individual artists and critics, such as Amrita Shergill, whose work will soon be on show at National Gallery Singapore, and Geeta Kapoor, the critic who I mentioned earlier, as well as more wide-ranging theoretical discussions, such as on the implications of the partition of India in 1947 on art historical methodology in the decades since. We are particularly delighted to welcome Professor Mathur here at NTU because of the many synergies between her distinguished scholarship and the research interests of our students at both the undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Professor Mathur has led an inspiring seminar earlier this week for students in our MA and PhD programs in art history and other disciplines, and I know we're all looking forward to today's lecture, which marks both the beginning of a new project and also a kind of return to her earlier work on migration and diaspora. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Saloni Matto.
Here we go. I'm like, oh, am I good? Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Roger. That was a lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. You make me sound interesting to myself and possibly even better than I have ever known. So, but thank you for that substantive, generous introduction. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here in Singapore. It's my first time to the city. And I've had an incredible week, and I'm grateful to many of you here at NTU and other institutions for your hospitality, especially for the students in the graduate seminar yesterday. I learned a lot about what they are doing here, and your questions were marvelous, so thank you for your engagement. But of course, the biggest gratitude goes to Roger himself, who has been an extremely attentive and gracious host and who facilitated every aspect of my trip and week-long stay, and I wouldn't be here without all of your efforts. So thank you so much, Roger. It's a pleasure. As Roger said, I'm going to be presenting brand new material tonight. So that makes me a little bit nervous, but also with the caveat that I'm excited to share it for the first time and really welcome your feedback and hope you understand that it's work in progress. It's in relation to a new book that deals with broadly migration and post-colonial dispossession. And I hope that by the end of my talk tonight, you'll have a better understanding of what I mean by that. So without further preamble, let me head to scene 1, belongings. During the 1990s and early 2000s, the Sunday New York Times Magazine featured a travel section called The Sophisticated Traveler. I'm not sure if any of you may remember it or have heard of it. But here, I believe when I was a student in New York in the 1990s, I learned for the first time that a sophisticated traveler was someone who packs lightly. Like the flight attendants who glide through airport terminals with their smart roller bags in perfect sync, a seasoned traveler, according to the New York Times, approaches their luggage with economy, precision, and streamlined efficiency. My own luggage as a graduate student in those days always seemed to fall very short of this bar. It was comprised of mismatched suitcases purchased from discount stores or oddly shaped bags that had been passed down from family or friends. It never seemed to have the same sort of sense of organization, order, control, or purpose. It reflected instead all of the untidiness and indecision of not knowing which items to take on a journey or which to leave behind. I always thought, how could anyone fully anticipate what they might need in advance of a trip? And who is capable of knowing the future in this way? Baggage, luggage, chests, trunks, suitcases, crates, totes, backpacks, boxes, bundles, and bags. The English language has no single word for the infinitely variable material forms that carry the things that we take on our journeys. At one level, these forms are protective containers that serve to transport our material possessions and personal effects. But at another level, luggage can carry attachments, memories, aspirations, heartbreak, emotions, and hopes in ways that, of course, exceed the utilitarian purposes of such forms. Perhaps that's why the word baggage emerges so rich with metaphor at the very outset. It conjures, as we know, emotional weight or a psychic burden, as in the idea of one's, quote, personal baggage, something that needs to be attended to or diligently unpacked. So with these issues of language in mind, my goal in this lecture is to pursue an alternate journey through what I'm calling the baggage claims of contemporary art. I will explore in particular the relationship between belonging and belongings in the context of artistic responses to the challenges of migration on a global scale. By this, I mean, I want to consider how the migrants' experience of uprooting and displacement is articulated through the actual physical baggage that human beings carry when they travel. Artists have long understood this interface between the material and the emotional in relation to the personal possessions that we take on a journey. Such an investment might be seen to begin with the modernist trope of the suitcase or valise, as it emerged within the European tradition of the historical avant-garde. My interest is in how contemporary artists, specifically those whose work engages with the legacies of colonialism and slavery, deploy material and pictorial strategies that challenge the nostalgic terms of those suitcase stories in ways that evoke more perilous pathways for the migrant in the 21st century. So by connecting these insights to the forms of labor historically attached to baggage, and I'll explain what I mean by that in more detail, to the racialized figures, for example, of the coolie or the Pullman porter in the US, I want to propose a broader dialectic between material possessions and the lived experience of dispossession, as it has been so powerfully expressed through the visual arts. And the image that you've been looking at is by an artist, Indian artist, Subodh Gupta, and I'll be returning to talk a lot more about this work later in the talk. So scene 2. I have 5 different scenes, by the way, in this talk. Scene 2, the carrying of things. The American photographer Margaret Bourke-White Life magazine photographs of refugees from India's partition in 1947 are iconic. That event involved the division of the subcontinent into 2 new nation states of India and Pakistan following independence from British rule, resulting in a massive transfer of population along religious lines. Bourke-White's black and white photos chronicle the exodus of terrified migrants on trains and show desperate human caravans crossing Punjab against the epic backdrop of earth and sky. Bullock carts and donkeys are loaded with the migrants' personal property. Some carry possessions in their arms or on their heads. For instance, a burlap bundle tied with rope or a cotton cloth turned into a carrying sack. A particularly melodramatic caption that I always recalled for one of these images, the one that you're looking at, read in the Life magazine original, quote, "Spindly but determined old Sikh carrying ailing wife sets out on the dangerous journey to India's border," unquote. And you can see the caption there. I was always struck by the heavy-handedness of that caption, with adjectives like spindly, old, determined, and ailing, describing the subjects of that photograph. But to pause and contemplate this famous picture is also to realize that the belongings being carried by 2 of the 6 individuals depicted are in fact other human beings. And so, of course, you can see the spindly, this according to Life magazine, and then this individual here is carrying what looks like a younger sibling or a child. So who carries things on their heads? Seems to me a reasonable question that emerges from Margaret Bourke-White's iconic photos. I put that query to generative AI on my computer, and the response that I got from my laptop was this. Quote, people in many cultures, particularly women in the rural areas of Africa and parts of Asia, commonly carry things on their heads, often balancing heavy loads like water jugs, baskets of food, or bundles of firewood on top of their heads, unquote. So like most things AI related, I take that sort of quick fact with a healthy dose of skepticism. But even as it confirms what I had already begun to surmise, that is to say, it is villagers, women, and other subaltern laborers, generally from ancient societies and the global south, who are accustomed to transporting things on their heads. And further, that there are vast knowledge and material systems to support this everyday practice that continues to exist largely outside of the Western world. The convergence between luggage and labor emerged in unique ways from the geopolitical conditions of empire and slavery in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The figure of the so-called coolie that you see on the two images on the left is a great example of a subject that was at the heart of new systems of racialized labor that took hold after the abolition of slavery and that upheld white supremacist hierarchies and the dehumanization of a cheap labor force. Coolie is actually a centuries-old term with Tamil roots that has shifting meanings, most of them until relatively recently pejorative. In India, it typically referred to the luggage-toting porters that swarmed train stations and shipping ports throughout the subcontinent during the era of the British Raj. But the name became a broader epithet for the indentured laborers brought from India to the European colonies in the Caribbean, South Africa, and of course the Indian Ocean Islands to work on plantations after the slave trade was abolished by Britain in 1833. Coolie has thus come to stand for a number of things, for a system of indentured labor, and in general, menial or manual labor. So what you're looking at in the two images here are two instances in the 20th century. The famous art reformer Mulk Anand, his 1934 novel titled The Coolie, which was really, as you can see by the cover, coolie for him was really the menial laborer. And so the coolie was the main character, a young boy who was at first a domestic servant, then worked in the factories, and then was a menial laborer. And really, Anand's extraordinary sort of anti-colonial novel is about the pathology of that British colonial system from the subjectivity of the person at the very bottom, the coolie, or in another novel of his, The Untouchable. And on the next image is The Coolie, the name of the movie, the Bollywood movie from 1983, right, starring Amitabh Bachchan, who's a kind of a heroic figure, and yes, of course, he gets the girl, that coolie figure. So, but another episode of luggage and labor born from the aftermath of slavery is evident in the phenomenon of the Pullman porter, which is the image you see on the right. These Black men were the former slaves hired by the Pullman Company in the late 1860s to work in the elegant new sleeper cars of their intercity trains. The Pullman porters did more than haul the luggage of the white passengers on the train cars that they themselves, of course, were not permitted to travel on under the racial segregation of Jim Crow laws. They also prepared the berths, cleaned the cars, shined shoes, served meals, and sang and performed for the ticketed passengers that they served. Influenced by the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois on the conditions of Black servitude in America, a group of Pullman porters formed the first all-Black union in 1925, called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, BSCP, which became central to the advancement of the civil rights movement and the establishment of a Black middle class in America. So indeed, one of the most iconic exhibits at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History today in Washington, D.C., is a restored Pullman passenger car from the early 20th century, which is the installation exhibit that you're seeing there. The exhibit thus presents the history of the Pullman porters as one of uplift and advancement through labor history, and celebrates their story, in the words of the museum, as a journey from, quote, servitude to civil rights, unquote. The Los Angeles-based artist Alison Saar's life-size wooden sculpture titled Breach from 2016 seems to me to summon these forgotten journeys of luggage and labor in almost apparitional ways, as if we are encountering the ghosts of ancestors. Saar's sculpture depicts a female figure stoically balancing an oversized load of household goods that includes trunks, suitcases, a wash tub, a chair, cooking pans, an iron, and a kerosene lamp. She stands on a raft-like wooden pallet, holding a pole, appearing steady and buoyant in spite of the gravity-defying load that she carries. An icon of resilience and strength over servitude, the carved wooden figure, as you can see from the back view, wears a kind of skin of compressed ceiling tin, a material used by Saar in several other works that simultaneously sort of evokes beauty, but also scarring and ultimately strength in the manner of a kind of body armor. Breach is part of a series by Saar that was informed by the Great Mississippi River Flood of 1927, which affected over 500,000 people, disproportionately African Americans, as well as the experience of Hurricane Katrina some 90 years later. The breach of the title thus refers both to flooding, when water's destructive force overwhelms levees and dams, but also to a sense of betrayal, as if a promise has been broken or breached, for instance, that of a society's commitment to racial equality and civil rights. 1 year later, in 2017, Saar's female figure appears in an entirely different work by the same name, this time a print on a frayed antique seed sack, this time pulling her small raft through water, you see on the left. In a companion print titled Staunch, and from 2017, a naked male figure is burdened by a rather different load that includes a shovel, ropes, a pickaxe, and a hammer. So the female figure has more domestic burdens and he has more sort of laboring burdens. But unlike the woman, the male figure is partly submerged, as if moving slowly in waist-deep water, recalling perhaps a fugitive's escape from servitude through the swampy backwaters of the American South. In both Saar's sculpture and printmaking practice, as one scholar has put it, the female body is a spiritual vessel. And indeed, these works express many of the recurring theme in Saar's work. The issue, for instance, of women's physical presence and their labor and resilience in relation to their communities. An earlier sculpture by Saar from 2006, titled Coup, also takes up the materiality of baggage, but here in a rather more sobering way, it seems to me. The installation Coup depicts a female figure sitting upright in the chair, again clad in that sort of rusted ceiling tin skin, and bound by a long braid of her own hair to a stack of old trunks and suitcases that are held together with rope behind her. Notably, Saar's seated woman holds a pair of scissors in her hand as if she's preparing to cut herself free from the weight of all of this onerous baggage. If the piece suggests somewhat bleak associations, for instance, the trauma of domestic servitude, the crisis of fertility and female reproduction, or the burden of homelessness and women's physical labor, the title seems to offer a glimmer of hope. A coup coup is, of course, a revolutionary action, after all, involving an overthrow of some sort and a transformation, at least, of the existing status quo. Scene 3, suitcase stories and the European avant-garde. When luggage and the icon of the suitcase in particular became one of the privileged tropes of the European avant-garde in the early decades of the 20th century, it had very little to say about the colonized and enslaved subjects whose fate was to carry the belongings of their white Western masters. Instead, for artists like and intellectuals like Marcel Duchamp and Walter Benjamin, the suitcase emerges not as a sign of the inequalities of race or indentured servitude, or as an upbeat motif of travel and adventure, but rather as a potent symbol of exile and dispossession. Duchamp's infamous work titled La Boîte en Valise, or Box in a Suitcase, comprised of reproductions of the artist's works inside a box, usually contained by a leather suitcase or valise, is perhaps the most famous example. These valise works by the artist, created sort of before and during the Second World War, when Duchamp was living as an expat in New York, Buenos Aires, and occupied France, offer a powerful meditation on his own conditions of exile, as the art historian K.J. Demos has argued in his book titled The Exiles of Marcel Duchamp. They also converge with the story of that mysterious suitcase with an unfinished manuscript in it that Walter Benjamin took with him to the Pyrenees Mountains when he sought to flee the Nazis as a German Jew in the spring of 1940 and chose instead to end his life at that border. Like Duchamp's valise works, the wrenching story of Benjamin's suitcase, entangled in the philosopher's suicide, evokes the dramatic experience of exile and loss, resulting, of course, from the horrors of fascism during the Second World War. But for our purposes, it is important to note how the relationship between belongings and the experience of non-belonging is first galvanized by the historical avant-garde in the context of a Europe in crisis, in order to challenge the equation of modernity with progress in the face of what Benjamin, of course, described differently as, quote, catastrophe rather than progress. Writing in the 1990s, at the time of another terrible war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the art historian Irit Rogov also reflected on the perils of belonging in relation to the motif of the suitcase and, of course, the geography of a Europe in crisis. For Rogov, the suitcase is a, quote, multiple marker, a sign that points in many directions at once, evoking connection and loss, but also arrival and departure, and, of course, memory and forgetting. Her account of the 30-foot wall of suitcases, baskets, and bundles that are topped with archival photographs comprising the centerpiece installation at the Ellis Island National Museum of Immigration in New York, when it opened in 1990, notes that the installation itself produced a sort of concrete boundary line that resembled a national border crossing. Rogov's objection and critique of this installation at the Immigration Museum in Ellis Island was that this suitcase installation thus signified the relics of the so-called old world versus the modernist dream of the immigrants', quote, new world, and thus came to, in her words, fairly strictly operate within such binaries, tending to affirm national entities and narratives within what she describes as a rather traditional sign system in the end. The rich motif of luggage, however, in the artist Jacob Lawrence's The Migration series emerges from the exact same historical moment as Benjamin and Duchamp, also 1940, 1941. And yet the work by this African-American painter, who was connected with the Harlem Renaissance, presents a powerful contrast to the suitcase aesthetics that are born out of the European tradition and its tendency to shore up the workings of nationalism in the manner that Rogoff has described. In this monumental 60-panel narrative series, which Lawrence had titled The Migration of the Negro, the artist chronicles the mass exodus of Blacks in America from the rural South to the industrial North that began during World War I as they fled the brutality of the sharecropper system and the ongoing conditions of white supremacy after slavery itself was abolished. And so this is the first image of his 60-panel series that shows the crowds heading by train to Chicago, New York, St. Louis, and northern cities. Lawrence undertook this extraordinary series at the age of 23, after he completed important portraits of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman that had established his reputation as a history painter. And yet the focus of the series, with its very distinctive color palette of brown, red, green, yellow, black, and white, is not the heroic figures of African-American society as in those previous portraits of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. It is rather instead the larger epic tale of the flight of Black labor, depicted this time as anonymous and mostly faceless crowds from the US South. In these very stylized panels depicting what Lawrence described as, quote, people on the move, people moving from one situation to another, I am struck by the way that luggage appears mostly as that which is lugged. Almost every individual in the crowd, for example, is depicted as bearing sacks or boxes or suitcases or crates, seemingly burdened by the weight of their personal belongings, in stark contrast in this image to the kind of effortless of a line of birds in flight. The image on the left, here, this image on the left, shows rows of people at the railroad station facing a line of trunks and chests that are circular, square, soft, and hard, which evoke a kind of threshold or border that needs to be crossed. In panel 39 on the right, we see a mother with a baby peering over her shoulder, sitting on the railway platform. Next to her is a small mountain of trunks and a billowing bag, some of the pieces larger than the woman herself, and together the luggage comprises more than half of the composition. In Lawrence's highly stylized image of child labor on Southern farms, which draws from the iconography of ancient Egypt, we are reminded of the physical correlation between laboring in the fields and hauling one's things. And this panel is quite different visually from the other 59 in his series, but he's doing what a lot of the painters of the Harlem Renaissance were doing at that time, turning to sort of iconography from Africa and ancient Egypt and so on. And Lawrence had titles or phrases that connected to every image. And this one, the title was Child Labor and a Lack of Education was one of the other reasons for people wishing to leave their homes. Elsewhere, we see what appears to be families in groups carrying suitcases by their handles across a barren stretch of land, an image that, like many in the series, conveys an underlying sense of purpose and determination. In the rather more grim reckoning in panel 55, the burden that is being lugged is that of a coffin hoisted on the shoulders of 3 pallbearers cloaked in black. And in Lawrence's final panel of the series, bearing the distinctly poetic title, "And the Migrants Kept Coming," the belongings form another threshold or line, this time in front of the anonymous crowd standing on the railway platform. In all of these different ways whereby the hauling of luggage may be seen as an extension of laboring in the fields or carrying the dead, and in the sheer burden of one's possessions within the deep historical cycles of dispossession. The motif of luggage in Lawrence's The Migration series points to a rather different journey of non-belonging and becoming than that of the European tradition of the Duchampian valise. Scene 4, baggage unchecked and beyond. So growing up, I recall the rumors that would float from time to time about the cause of tragic plane crashes of flights over South Asia and the Middle East. These planes, often carrying pilgrims traveling to Mecca for Hajj, would horrifyingly burst into flames in the air and instantly kill everyone on board. The lack of any forensic understanding of these events led to much speculation about possible passenger behavior as the cause of these crashes. They were villagers dumbstruck by their first experience on a plane. There were language barriers and cultural barriers. They opened a door at 10,000 feet. They struck a match to light a kerosene stove. That last image always haunted me. I always imagined a traveler wanting to heat their own presumably halal food, striking a match to light their portable burner at the routine start of a meal service on a flight, and then suddenly, kaboom. It is undoubtedly stuff of the imagination, an urban myth or legend, which by definition are creepy fictional stories connected to some of our worst societal fears. We know these stories are probably not true, but they get repeated so often that they are believed to be true. So if the sophisticated traveler travels light, other kinds of travelers seem fated to carry with them the extensive material trappings of domestic space. A mattress bundle, bedding, cookware, a TV in a cardboard box, food, spices, utensils, chickens, goats, a bucket of oil, a potentially lethal kerosene stove on a flight. The cumbersome cargo depicted in Subodh Gupta's 2003 series Sat Samandar Par, or Across the Seven Seas, could easily be that of Hajj pilgrims to Mecca. Instead, the travelers that are presented here are South Asian migrant workers journeying to and from the Gulf, who nonetheless shared a similar itinerary. In these oil paintings and chromogenic prints on paper, Gupta adopts a very stylized photorealism to focus on the humble worldly possessions of the migrant worker on the move. The series shows unwieldy overstuffed bundles tied tightly together, bulging bags and boxes on luggage carts, or being hoisted onto the roof of a taxi. Luggage is shrink wrapped in plastic to prevent it from bursting during transit. The mood is slightly tense, evoking the stress of a busy airport or a train platform. Bodies struggle, it seems to me, to manage the gambit of their overweight possessions. And the freeze frame focus that he has on these tense moments suggests precarity and a lack of an organization or a plan. Other works in Gupta's series show this cargo literally popping out of the painting to comprise cardboard box installations, sculptural installations on the gallery floor. And later, this is the image that I showed you at the outset, Gupta casts the baggage in bronze, gold, and aluminum, perhaps to honor the preciousness of these possessions, as if they were baby shoes being bronzed for posterity. Here we see the artist's signature use of slick materials like stainless steel, brass, and gold. He's come to be known for this material, which comes to stand, of course, for both the illusion and the allure of so-called India Shining, a campaign by the Indian government at the dawn of late capitalism in the 21st century. Gupta's series can be seen alongside several other contemporary artists that have embraced the unwieldy belongings of present-day migrants in ways that focus the most urgent inequalities of our time. Another powerful example seems to me to rest in the work of Camilo Ontiveros, a Los Angeles-based artist of Mexican origin. For his installation, Temporary Storage, The Belongings of Juan Manuel Montes, the artist collected the possessions that remained in the bedroom of Juan Manuel Montes, a DACA student, which is a deferred action childhood arrival, a category of, you know, I guess asylum in the United States. He was a DACA student from Mexico and the very first individual to be deported by the Trump administration in 2017. Among the personal items that the artist obtains from the young man's family were Montes's bed, television, desk, chair, books, clothing, a basketball, and bedding. Ontiveros then bound the possessions together with heavy rope to produce a tilted sculptural form, precariously balanced on those two metal sawhorses. In this way, Ontiveros's installation of the deportees' possessions became an emotionally charged memorial to the plight of the stateless subject who has been forcibly removed, and to the heartbreaking personal experience of their loss to the family. Adding to its complexity, this work revisited and reactivated the artist's 2009 installation that you see on the left, titled Temporary Storage, in which Ontiveros ties up his own possessions while a graduate student at UCLA during a period of temporary homelessness when he himself lacked official papers. It also recalled his 2008 series, which you see on the right, called Deportables, made of discarded mattresses bound up tightly with rope, which sort of to me resonates with the cumbersome form of Subodh Gupta's packages, even as they sort of point to a more organic orientation. Here, the rope and its metaphoric entanglements take on a particularly rich symbolism. As the artist has stated, the things of my sculptures are indexes of people, movements, labor, life, bound up in processes that are difficult to unravel, unquote. If the mattress here becomes the bare minimum possession for the itinerant body to sleep, the proximity of bedding to the body points both to a kind of resilience and precarity, to the idea of rest and inhospitality. Needless to say, Ontiveros's work, which was created in response to the first Trump administration in America, speaks more powerfully than ever before to our current moment in the United States. The self-stated goal of the second Trump regime's unprecedented anti-immigration policy is the detention and deportation of millions of undocumented people, which will essentially revoke the right to seek asylum that has underpinned American immigration policy for the past 75 years. The question of statelessness and the exiled refugee is also at the heart of an exemplary luggage work by the acclaimed conceptual artist Mona Hatoum, titled Traffic. Or sorry, well, it has two titles. I've seen it called Traffic, and in this version it's called Exodus. Exodus is highly representative of the Palestinian artist's long-standing poetics surrounding themes of home, exile, and estrangement, which often draws from everyday objects in ways that are profoundly unsettling. Here, two used suitcases standing upright on the floor are connected to each other by a thick tress of human hair that appears to flow out from their sides. It recalls the work, of course, by Alison Saar that we looked at earlier, which similarly connects luggage to human hair in slightly haunting ways. Hatoum's piece points in one sense to the traffic of human beings on the world stage, but in another sense, it highlights the subjectivity of the traveler whose body is inextricable from the suitcase that she carries. The solidity of luggage form seems entirely at odds with the fragile tactility of the human hair, and the tightly shut suitcases are seem unable to control the hair that's spilling out of them, suggesting the futility of acts of containment or repression. Giving rise to metaphors of uprootedness and non-belonging, Hatum's powerful yet highly economical aesthetic gesture reflects what Edward Said so eloquently identified as the artist's, quote, logic of irreconcilables, whereby, as Said put it, familiarity and strangeness are locked together in the oddest of ways, offering in the end neither respite nor rest, unquote. So, a final contemporary work that I wish to highlight is perhaps for me the most resonant of all, and that is the African-American artist Glenn Ligon's 1993 project titled To Disembark. That is because Ligon's installation challenges the connection between luggage and labor and the human subject, evident in the works that I have discussed thus far, and presents instead the startling collapse between the crate and its cargo under the devastating conditions of chattel slavery. Depicted on the cover, as you see in the bottom left, of the art historian Huey Copeland's very important book about Blackness, slavery, and contemporary art, Ligon's installation consisted of 9 shipping crates of roughly the same dimensions dispersed across the floor of the gallery space. The crates, with their contents marked fragile, were a reference to the box in which the infamous fugitive slave, Henry Brown, shipped himself to freedom in 1849 by traveling inside a wooden box from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia, which was a free city at the time. So that's the kind of imagery and the story of Henry Box Brown, who ships himself to freedom. In Ligon's installation, the crates also have a sonic component and emit sort of barely audible sounds, a heartbeat, some songs by Billie Holiday and Bob Marley, and an African spiritual sung by Paul Robeson. Elsewhere on the gallery walls were reproductions of 19th century handbills demanding the return of runaway slaves, all of them naming and describing the artist himself in a kind of tongue-in-cheek subversion of this terrible print genre. So I guess you can't read it, but it says, "Ran away Glenn, a black male, 5'8", very short hair." The artist describes himself as the runaway slave repeatedly in these handbills that are on the gallery wall. In his book, Huey Copeland seizes on the motif of fugitivity in this work, arguing that Ligon's art reflect the, quote, unmoored status of marginalized subjects and addressed especially the status of queer Black men in multicultural America in the early 1990s. But for our purposes, Ligon's crates are also a reminder that the enslaved subject of African descent was denied that primal dignity of carrying possessions during the terror-filled crossings of the transatlantic slave trade. Slaves were, of course, stripped of any material property of their own in order to become the property of others. Their bodies defined as cargo within the hold of the slave ship and as commodities for exchange within the legal structures of chattel slavery. Ligon's work captures this most extreme historical instance of the dispossession via material possessions dialectic that I've been interested in by exposing the excruciating predicament of the enslaved subject as both person and property at the same time. Here, of course, the self is not permitted any possessions on a journey, reduced instead to the status of human freight. Now, if these slightly suffocating historical conditions allow little room to breathe, and in fact, the box has that effect, the crate in Ligon's installation, the title of his work at least offers a small modicum of relief. That's because To Disembark suggests, of course, the end of a journey and evokes arrivals, new beginnings, and processes of renewal over time. So, final scene. The baggage claims of contemporary art. So, what in the end are the baggage claims of contemporary art? Or put differently, why does the status of luggage in visual art from the 20th and 21st century matter? And how does this rather peculiar optic contribute to the broader understanding of migrant dispossession in our contemporary world? It's useful to recall here that Hannah Arendt, in her seminal insights on the phenomenon of non-belonging in the modern era, characterized stateless people as, quote, the most symptomatic group in contemporary politics, unquote. Arendt's foundational contribution was to recognize that the individual outside the nation-state system, who had no place in the world and nowhere to go, could tell us much more about the workings of the political order than the legally sanctioned citizen whose status was secure. Her formulations are all the more meaningful because they emerged, of course, from the horrors of the Holocaust in Europe and her own status as a stateless refugee, Jewish refugee, for over 18 years, from 1933 to 1951. However, the primary locus for statelessness today, what has been called the, quote, migrant crisis or the refugee crisis in the Western world for the past decade now, does not reside with those displaced internally within Europe, but with foreigners arriving from outside the borders of Europe and America, seeking refuge from their own societies in crisis. In other words, the new geopolitics of statelessness appears to have shifted from Hannah Arendt's time onto the figure of the non-European subject, those hailing from the global south or post-colonial societies, in ways that even Arendt herself could not have foreseen. That this is, of course, part of a long historical process of dispossession that produced our world through the terrible social inequalities of slavery and colonialism is something that is too often subsumed, it seems to me, in popular and media reports about this ongoing, quote, crisis. So in this lecture, I have suggested that luggage does matter insofar as it provides a lens onto the experience of non-belonging through the varied motifs and metaphors of one's personal belongings. Artists from the historical avant-garde, most notably Marcel Duchamp, have long understood that the existential experience of displacement can be conveyed through the physical materiality of what we take on our journeys. And yet, alongside these suitcase stories emerging from the European avant-garde are very different images of what it means to lug one's personal belongings through crises and or mass migrations. Margaret Bourke-White's photographs of partition refugees in South Asia carting their personal property in bullock carts and on their heads, and Jacob Lawrence's depiction of the sheer burden of baggage, akin to the weight of a coffin or of laboring in the fields, both also emerged in the 1940s in response to, of course, very different forms of geopolitical crises in the first half of the 20th century. In these paintings and photographs, as I suggested, luggage appears essentially as something that is lugged. What we see here is a history of subaltern subjects caught up in waves of forced migration that were the direct result, not of fascism in Europe and the Second World War, but of the unraveling of slavery and the relationships of empire. Contemporary artists like Alison Saar and Mona Hatoum have repositioned the suitcase in their installations, connecting it to the ongoing crisis of dislocation emerging from these latter histories, and significantly, in their cases, to the female body through the suitcase's entanglements with human hair. In To Disembark, Glenn Ligon, of course, reminds us of the primal trauma that reduced human beings to cargo themselves, of those who were stripped of their personal property in order to become the property of others. In a different vein, it seems to me, artists Subodh Gupta and Camilo Ontiveros embrace the possessions of marginalized subjects in today's world, migrant workers and deportees, in ways that seem to honor their struggles by valorizing their cargo or valuing their cargo through the preciousness of coating them in silver and bronze, or collecting their property into makeshift memorials with the primary purpose of not forgetting their loss, like little altars to their ill-fated journeys. These are but a few examples of how contemporary artists have captured the ongoing crises of belonging through the material forms of one's personal belongings. There are undoubtedly many more examples from elsewhere around the world. My aim in this talk has been simply to tag some of these diverse strategies as part of the baggage claims of contemporary art. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saloni, for that wonderful talk, which was simultaneously very, very focused on a single trope, the kind of something you called a peculiar optic, but also a motif and a metaphor. And yet at the same time as being so very tightly focused was also incredibly wide ranging. You showed us images from the span of a century, from several different continents, ranging from contemporary art to news journalism, to modern art, to other things in between. I know that we have a number of people joining us online. So for those who are joining online, if you have questions or comments for Professor Mathur, please scan the QR code on your screen. And for those who are in the room, you can do the same thing as well if you like, or you can simply raise your hand. Can I get a sense of whether there are any immediate questions or comments to begin? At the back, Alicia. We're going to be passing around the microphone for the benefit of the people online.
Thank you, Professor. Oh, can you hear me? Oh. Oh, okay. So it's just okay. Thank you, Professor Mathur, for this visually arresting talk. My question might take you in a somewhat different direction. So what I was actually thinking about, having looked at the images, is I was reminded of this essay I was reading recently about material minimalism that's become this dominant aesthetic in the world that we live in. There's like culture around decluttering, living in smaller minimalist spaces. And the goal for a lot of these decluttering gurus is that you are to create a space in which you feel like you've just arrived in that space, or you're ready to pack up and go at any time. And this is something sort of in much more modern urban sort of living. That's what we kind of desire at the moment, this sort of minimalist aesthetic. And I was wondering, what is that relationship you might think that a lot of us aspire to, this material minimalism, as an aesthetic and as a feeling, with like some of the artwork, that is a type of enforced or brutally enforced minimalist way of living, that you have to take the barest essentials with you. Yeah, I don't know what kind of direction my question would take, but that was kind of my first thought. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You can hear me? Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I don't know that this will directly address what you're getting at, but it seems to me to resonate with my own kind of experimental play of these scenes and vignettes, and remembering these stories about being a sophisticated traveler, traveling lightly, and then being shocked by the idea that somebody was carrying a kerosene stove, a South Asian traveler, and could explode the plane by lighting the stove. So I've inserted those kind of vignettes and stories because, of course, luggage and baggage and stuff and traveling is something that we're all always entangled in, right? So it was hard to completely just shift the perspective to an objective stance. So I think that's that, not really realizing, I think that's why I wanted to resonate with personal stories. And I think the reason for that, and this gets maybe closer to what you're getting at, is that what emerges is, of course, is an entire value system around stuff and the way we carry stuff. And the sophisticated traveler is, of course, a bourgeois traveler that has an ease with their stuff and, you know, streamline, efficient, etc. And that's an entire value system. And the, you know, the subjects, the way and the modes of stuff, the excess of stuff in Subodh Gupta's series of migrant workers is something that I think we all want to distance ourselves from, that subalterity that brings domestic stuff with them on a trip. And so I think that's the same kind of issue around as what you're calling minimalism as a kind of value, I would say. It's a bourgeois value, it seems to me. And there's always something at stake in trying to distance ourselves from the subaltern other who is not achieving that lightweightness in the world, right? That's burdened by the stuff. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Roger. Just a general wondering, really. Is there any space in your work or thinking for homelessness? Because non-belonging, of course, it can mean displacement from one country to another. But it seems to me that in the UK and in the USA, homelessness has never been as serious as it is right now. Cities like San Francisco are really experiencing that. And I have a mental image of, you know, I lived for the last couple of years over in the United States, and every junction in the roads, there's people with shopping trolleys full of whatever it is they belong. And they don't want to settle in one place too long because they'll get picked up. So you keep moving, probably that's why it's shopping trolleys. But I enjoyed your talk very much, but I was just wondering, with the modern phenomenon of homelessness, is there space maybe for some reflection on that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it seems to me to be entangled and continuous with the themes that I was looking at, which was actually baggage and travel and migrants and how that appears in contemporary art. But I'm trying to think of an artist, and I'm sure they exist, who are engaging with the relationship of dispossession to homelessness and the lack of possessions, or the devaluation of the possessions of the homeless subject, which is basically treated as detritus or garbage, right? And I'm sure that there's a lot there, but I think it's the same dynamic and dialectic between belongings and non-belonging and homelessness. Exactly the same kind of, I guess, framework or what would we call it? I don't know, ethics at stake, I would say, yeah, and valuations around that material stuff, yeah. Your comment reminds me again of an anecdote. I was speaking with my mother, who lives in Vancouver, Canada, and she told me recently last year the mayor did an entire sweep of entire encampments of homeless folks, and what they did for those tent encampments was provide each homeless person with a garbage bin on wheels, a blue bin, to put their stuff in and to move. And she talked about how appalling and the indignity of giving them all garbage bins for their possessions. And so there they were pushing along the garbage bins. And she said, you know, the dehumanization of that action, why couldn't they they be given some luggage or something else on wheels, but actual garbage. So that seems to me to be such an expression of the dehumanizing that you're referring to.
Maybe I can just, if I could just remind the people who are online that you're also able to submit questions via the QR code. And perhaps while I have the microphone, I abuse my privilege to ask you a question, or actually a couple of questions. I was really struck by your statement about how the incredible paintings of Jacob Lawrence were contemporaneous exactly with the works of Marcel Duchamp and the travel and then suicide of Walter Benjamin. And I think what that observation enables for us, and what perhaps your entire talk with its kind of trans-historical, transnational approach to this very focused motif might enable for us, is a different lineage for contemporary art as a whole. With your focus on the contemporary art of the Global South, you're drawing our attention to a whole history of images and representations like those of the Pullman Porters, the Coolies, and so on, that are out of view if we focus on contemporary art's debts to the European avant-garde and to people like Duchamp. I think we're used to stories of contemporary art by art historians like Terry Smith, maybe Hal Foster, who propose an idea of contemporary art as being obsessed with modernism, by which they mean obsessed with the European avant-garde, with people like Duchamp and thinkers like Benjamin. Whereas I think that by refocusing our attention on this motif of luggage and on historical figures like Lawrence, as well as more recent figures like Saar and Hatoum and Ligon and so on, you're suggesting a different kind of story of contemporary art that has its debts not only in a European avant-garde and perhaps not only in modern art, but also in images of humanity that have proliferated around the South and of the South as well. So I suppose first question is, what would you say about that? And maybe the second question is, how does this lecture that you've given us today relate to your larger project, the larger book project, which for the first time, I think in a while, sees you telling the stories of contemporary art of the Global South and not only of South Asia?
Well, thank you, Roger. What do I think of how you just summarized the talk? I think that's brilliant. I think that's exactly what I said, and you made it make sense. So yeah, I thank you for articulating what I was trying to do. Listening to you made me realize that a probably more precise response to the question that you just raised about homelessness was that the way the talk tonight was specifically focused on these particular histories of dispossession, right? Post-colonial through slavery and empire. So that homelessness is a sort of not tethered directly to those histories. So it's kind of outside my argument, as it were, but it's absolutely relevant to the dynamics and the meanings at stake of possessions. How does it relate to my larger project? So I'm hoping you now have a sense, and I'm still searching for a better vocabulary, but I hope you now have a sense of what I mean by post-colonial dispossession. I'm talking about dispossession not at large, but through these two specific histories, the empire and slavery. And I'm talking about, my interest is in artists, both historically and in the present, who engage with those histories, okay? So, and that, yes, typically seems to me to be artists, African-American artists, as well as artists from the Global South. And I guess another investment now in this project, moving away from a lot of my own writing, which is around South Asian artists, is to try to put sort of Black studies in conversation with post-colonial studies in the way that I kind of came of age with it. And so thinking about the resonances of the transatlantic crossing alongside histories of empire. And I'm really following artists that help us to make those connections in very rich ways. Yeah. Does that respond to you?
Thank you. It's really nice that we have a number of students in the room, including our postgraduate students. So I'd like to particularly encourage the students here to feel free to ask questions or make comments. We do have one already from online, from someone who I think is one of our postgraduate students. She thanks you, Professor, for the talk. And she asks, how do we reconcile topophilia for a place as opposed to the place that has been packed into a suitcase? It's a really interesting question and reminds me of the statement from Jacob Lawrence, I think it was, that you quoted about these people he was depicting moving from one situation to another situation. We often think of migration in terms of something that's perpetually in flux and dynamic, but I think the question reminds us that there is also a sense of longing for very specific places that needs to be factored in as well. Thanks for the question, Cheryl.
Wow, what an amazingly interesting question. I wish you were here in the room so I could ask you what you think about this. How do we reconcile topophilia? So I guess I would want to ask you what that means to you for a place, as opposed to the place that is packed into a suitcase. I'm trying to unpack that question. Does anybody want to take a stab? Topophilia for a place, meaning the desire for connecting to a place is how I guess I would understand that. That particular phobia or philia, rather, as opposed to the place that has been packed into a suitcase. Yeah, right. So I don't know that it's a reconciliation that is necessary. I think the place gets packed into the suitcase to bring with you. The portability of connections to place is what we take with us when we travel. And of course, that can be very primal in personal effects, just to be able to shift and make another place. So for example, antivirus is bedding. Just the mattress is the most basic ingredient to travel, it seems to me, for the body to rest. And that is about placemaking, right? To bring a possession or two to connect to a new place. And so I think that the objects that we take in a suitcase are about placemaking. And I have no idea whether that addresses your super interesting question.
I think we have a question over here, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Saloni. And I guess it's slightly connected to the question by Cheryl. So on topophilia, I'm not sure whether she's referring to like Yifu Tuan's concept of it. But then since we are talking about place here, I'm also one thing that strikes me about all these fascinating works that you've mentioned is it seems that, and thanks a lot for filling me in because of my limited knowledge of like South Asian or Black history and all. But I think what strikes me is it seems that all the works that you've mentioned, there is no like a representation of the place or the background. In terms of the background, I don't see a lot. So it's kind of like an empty space in most of the, whether it's the photographs that you've highlighted or the contemporary artworks. So one thing I'm interested to perhaps hear a little bit more about is whether well, I have a feeling that artists perhaps are also deliberately stripping off or detaching the work from like a background in some case, although it's obviously culturally it has such a kind of rich background to it. But then what I'm interested in knowing is the context of when these works are being exhibited in like contemporary art spaces, whether we can perhaps also interpret them in different ways, or do they also or do they vary at all when they are placed whether it's where or how or when they are being placed, or do they all share the same kind of interpretations that we get?
Yes, thank you for your question. I think maybe maybe you're getting at something like my own sort of methodology in constructing a framework and this argument. I have been taken license to kind of make a curatorial selection of artists that make sense to me both historically and um, and also that meet the interests and my concerns, that articulate those things for me. And the result has been that I've made a broad selection from very many locations. You know, Subodh Gupta is based in Delhi. That all of the work is in the early 21st century, except for Glenn Ligon. So I'm all over the place. There's Los Angeles artists, Mexican-American artists, African-American artists, South Asian artists. And the work is distributed all over the place as well, various collections. It's been shown in various biennials, very different contexts. So I am, I would say, indulging in a methodology of decontextualizing in order to assemble a new framework. And so I see that, I guess it could be problematic. It's not art historical in the sense of telling the evolution of a group of artists working on this kind of thing, but I see it as a selection process that allows me to think through contemporary art practices. And so if it feels a little decontextualized to you, it was.
Thanks. We do have a few more minutes for another couple of questions or comments, either online or in the room.
Wow, thank you so much. That was a gorgeous reading of so many works that I think some of us know very well, some that are new to us, and it was just wonderful to sort of work through them with you. And I really appreciate you sharing work that is also sort of early-ish stage. I mean, clearly quite well developed, but it's very generous to share this with us in this way. A few things that just sort of came to mind that you can comment on or not. You know, as you were sort of going through this sort of lineage related to the materiality of baggage, I was also quite struck with the concept of transit, which is something that I've sort of in other veins been thinking about. So I don't know if that's useful to you. It's, you know, kind of rather than travel, transit is, you know, this sort of harder to define term, also very much this sort of state of never arriving or never departing. It's we're always in transit. I'm also part of a research network called the Transit Asia Research Network, which semantically is confusing, but I love it because of that. So just wanted to offer that. It also struck me that you were sharing this really interesting sort of material history, going from a much more portable art commodity of the, you know, the boîte en valise itself kind of being this portable oeuvre, the sort of discrete, you know, sort of easily purchased, or at least sort of more easily purchased format of paintings, then looking into the sort of realm of installation and the sort of more awkward way of experiencing that work, where it has to, you know, be accompanied by an exhibition infrastructure. I'd also be interested to hear if there are elements of dematerialization and sort of the digital that might end up coming into some of this work, because that also seems like an important counterpoint to some of the sort of the heaviness of the objects that were shared with us. And then it also brought to mind for me kind of the grotesque portability of some of the large art objects in conversation in the art world, and specifically, you know, this culture of not just traveling exhibitions, but art fairs, and, you know, the sort of the bravado of sort of, you know, transiting artworks through places often for rather limited stays, and the sort of harsh reality of people not having the mobility. some of these artworks. So quite a lot of things that came to mind. So thank you for listening to my list of comments, and you're welcome to respond to any or none.
Thank you, Karen, for those rich set of comments. To begin with your last one, are there artworks that you had that you were thinking about that speak to the circuits of travel of the art world itself? Is that what you were sort of getting at? Was there something that came to mind? Oh, sorry.
Microphone in transit, I guess. I mean, one thing that came to mind just from having seen Subodhgupta's work at the Monet in Paris was also kind of thinking about the, you know, the carbon footprint of that type of, you know, sort of large scale solo show with, you know, many large works. So just, you know, that being kind of a point of resonance. And then I guess I wasn't thinking about sort of individual artworks so much as the general portability of the art fair or the exhibition infrastructure.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that rich set of comments. Hopefully I try to address a couple of things that you said. Well, I think the distinction between well, both Duchamp's suitcase, which contained, of course, little tiny miniature reproductions of his entire body of work, and then he does, you know, 300 of the series, proliferates them, etc., which is very, very self-referential about the art world and how art can travel and the containment and reproduction, etc. All of those themes are there. The reason that that kind of self-referential content, let's say, about art worlds and the circuitry and, as you say, the footprint of travel there. The reason that that's not as of interest to me is because I think I'm invested in this these two forms of travel out of two historical experiences. Okay, so travel in general around the art world doesn't quite connect to my historical genealogy. And to me, that's forms of travel that are now related to what we might call subaltern subjects or inequalities around travel, migrant subjects that are stateless or non-belonging. Okay, so that's why that particular connection to certain histories is the modes of travel that I'm invested in. The concept of transit is super interesting, of course, yeah, versus travel. I'm sure you've thought much more about that. Transit, of course, is a much more in between space. So it's very rich and resonant. And absolutely, I think, you know, artists like all of the ones that I've showed, Jacob Lawrence and Bourke-White, that's everybody's in transit, moving from one place to another. They're describing the in-betweenness of that. Yeah. So it's a rich term too. I would have to think more about the work that transit does over travel. Yeah. I think it suggests a little more liminality, and I like that sense of it. And then in terms of the digital medium, the thing that occurred to me is that Subodhgupta is a great example, it seems to me, of that he's using this kind of photorealism in the paintings and sort of a digital process there initially, and then he brings weight to the picture too. So the lightness is in the first depictions in this digital renderings, and then literally the boxes pop out of the paintings onto the floor and become three-dimensional, and then bronze and so on. And so they progressively become more weighty, I would say. So he's a good example, it seems to me, of an artist that's you know, using those media forms to create different kinds of meanings. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, so I think this will have to be our last couple of questions that have come in from online. One is from our graduate student, Shakira, who asks you whether the idea of belonging morphs when these artworks are collected by and so belong to institutions. So I wonder if that's a question that might allow you to reflect on how the writing of this project in the context of your fellowship at MoMA has unfolded. And the second question is from someone named Andrew, who tells us that his recent work is dealing with highlighting the connected journeys of loved ones dealing with displacement. And the question is, what's your opinion on companionship over objects, or perhaps even companionship with objects? So thanks for those two questions, and they'll be our last ones for today.
Wow. Okay. It's always hard for me to just take a question without a dialogue, but you think the idea of belonging morphs when these artworks are collected by and so they belong to institutions? Well, I think that that's another kind of belonging that I guess one could, and I think now, again, we're talking about circuitry of the art world and collecting practices and ownership and property, but in a different register, and again, not as historically relevant to the kinds of dispossession that I'm interested in. So yes, it morphs, and in a different direction that could be fruitful, but I don't think that I'm headed towards. And then the second question by Andrew is that his recent work highlights the connected journeys of loved ones dealing with displacement. What is my opinion on companionship over objects? Wow. I would hopefully never have to actually choose one or the other, but I would always prioritize companionship, certainly. I guess I'm not entirely sure what. I would love to learn more about what your work is doing in terms of loved ones and displacement. I imagine that is about physical separation between people and companionship. So I think that possibly, just to think it through my own material, possibly the work that comes to mind for that is the Camilo Antiveros' possessions of the deported son. And that's really not so much companionship, but the loss of loved one. And it's like kind of like a memorial to that loss of that family. The parents of that boy worked with that artist very emotionally and passionately because they understood that what was being done was the memory of that loved one and his loss through his possessions. So it seems to me that's a case where possibly what you're talking about in terms of companionship or loving relationships come to converge on belongings in the artist's relationship to him.
I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you again, Professor Matur, for being so generous today, but also all week with your time, your expertise, and with sharing this new research. And thank you all for being here. Please join me in thanking Professor Matur again.